And welcome back, rugby fans, to Rugby411. As always, I'm your host. My name is Joshua Shibata, and this is our Rugby Nations Cup, which is what is being kind of called Nations Cup, Nations League competition. What we know video. So, a little bit of background if you haven't really been following rugby too much or haven't really been paying attention to all the big news. For the last, who knows, however many years, there has been talk about the World Rugby Association trying to make a global competition similar to the Rugby World Cup, which is where there's always been a lot of controversy about this. That will involve not only the top tier nations, but also the secondary and maybe even third tier nations to try to increase the competition level across all boards. Now, we'll go into a little bit of the criticism of this model and why it feels like that's not what it's trying to accomplish. But again, this video really is more about what we know and just trying to lay the groundworks for those of you who don't really follow too much of the rules or maybe a little bit confused about what all the hoopla is about. Okay, so first of all, again, right now tentatively called the Nations Cup, Nations League. It's going to be a biannual, meaning it's taking place every other year, competition starting in 2026. It's going to involve two groups. You have your first tier, which will involve 12 teams, and these 12 teams are all the teams that are involved in the Six Nations, which is England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, France, Italy. And then your teams that are involved in the Sanzar unit or the Rugby Championship competition, which if you notice Sanzar, what that means is really an acronym of all the teams that are involved. SA for South Africa, NZ for New Zealand, A for Australia, and AR for Argentina. So Sanzar. Cute. And then you have two other nations yet to be named. Now, here's where the rumors coming in. Those two nations more than likely will be Fiji and Japan. Reason why people believe this, and I too believe this as well, I'm going to pop up your top 12, currently top 12 ranked rugby teams. And if you see these top 12 teams, you'll notice those are the 12 teams I just mentioned. Your Six Nation teams, your Sanzar, and look, at 10 and 12, you have Fiji and you have Japan. So the top tier, right? That's where we get the top tier, that first tier. So those 12 teams are going to compete in the first tier of this competition. And then you'll have a second tier, which is going to be made up of 12 other teams. What those teams are, who they are, how they're going to be determined has yet to be announced. Talk is, again, it's just going to basically be the next 12 in line, 13 through 24. And if you kind of look at that, and I'm going to bring those teams up, it's honestly, it's all the teams that are currently playing or currently qualified in the Rugby World Cup. Portugal, who did amazing at number 13 this World Cup. They won over a lot of fans. They got their first win over Fiji. They tied with Georgia as well during the Rugby World Cup. The before mentioned Georgia, Samoa, Tonga, Uruguay, Romania, Namibia, and Chile. The teams that aren't the teams that are in this top 24 that did not make the Rugby World Cup is USA, Canada, Spain at 19. Spain, though, there was, some controversy, if you didn't notice, about fielding illegal players during their qualification process. So technically, that's what booted them out. And then you have Hong Kong, which is the last team that didn't make it into the competition. So, teams that are pretty much on that level of competition, Rugby World Cup. But again, the talk about this year's Rugby World Cup, where there was kind of unfair competition between the first tier and second tier, where you had blowout scores of 76-0, 87-7. These are teams that are there, but not quite there. And so these teams are going to be in that second tier. Now, the whole point of this competition is to allow these teams to play against each other, but then eventually have a promotion regulation level where your bottom tier teams and the first tier might get demoted or regulated down to the second tier, and the second tier teams are able to move up to then compete with these top tier nations. something that, a lot of people have been trying to beg for Six Nations and the Rugby Championship to do, but those teams don't want to do that. They don't. Teams like Italy and France and Argentina don't want to lose their spot in these really important yearly competitions. So this Rugby Nations Cup is supposed to be able to allow these second-tier teams to move up into the first tier. Now, here's something that some people have been criticizing. There won't be any promotion or regulation until 2030. So the third edition of this competition, which some people have been screaming, that's like the biggest thing that they feel you're locking up this competition until 2030, which for a lot of us, that's like a ways away. But again, I feel, and we'll kind of jump into this right now, that this competition still is allowing teams the possibility in the future, maybe not immediately, but in the future of allowing some sort of crossover. Also, too, and if you watched my prior video about the recent announced Pacific Nations Cup, this allows, at least for right now, granted, some people are screaming bloody murder about this, it allows two teams, those two mysterious teams, who are possibly going to be Fiji and Japan, whichever two teams that are going to be added to that first tier nation group, allows them at least to compete with these top level tier teams that they normally wouldn't be. Japan rarely ever gets to play against any of the Six Nations teams. They'll play against New Zealand and Australia every so often, South Africa too, but rarely are they able to play too much against Italy, England, France, and Scotland outside of a Rugby World Cup cycle. So this allows them to compete every other year on a pretty high caliber level competition. Now again, when 2030 rolls around, you'll see some regulation and other teams will get the chance. So, there's a lot of criticism of this model because of, they feel it's still locking up the top tiers, is not allowing the second tier nations, your USA, your Samoa, Uruguay, Romania, to have that chance. But I feel this is the pathway, or at least to start to doing it. Plus, again, we also don't know what teams are in the second tier or what two teams are even in the first tier, so we're still making a lot of assumptions here. Also, we don't know when the regulation and promotion starts in 2030, how many teams are going to be promoted, what is the criteria to it. So there's still a lot of things that haven't been confirmed, and a lot of people are just really are jumping to conclusions on it. The final thing is that this competition is going to take place in July and November, so both of those windows kind of avoid your Six Nations competition, which occurs in February and March, and your Rugby Championship, which usually occurs in August and October. Another criticism that this Nations Cup gets, which I kind of mentioned at the beforehand, it's very similar to the Rugby World Cup, which some people are feeling, well, if you have this one, especially that it happens every other year, and the way it kind of lines up, when it happens in 2030, that's right before the 2031 Rugby World Cup, which happens here in the United States. It kind of takes away the excitement a little bit of the Rugby World Cup, which I do kind of agree with that. It's kind of interesting that this is happening every 2 years, and kind of weird years too at that. Not necessarily like, right in the middle between Rugby World Cups, but it's kind of at the edge. So it takes place before and after a Rugby World Cup. So it's kind of weird with that, but I mean, maybe it'll work out. We'll see. Also, too, we might find the Rugby Nations Cup kind of will lead into some sort of qualification process going into the following year's Rugby World Cup. Again, Rugby World Cup 2031 happens here in the United States. This 2030 Rugby Nations Cup might somehow play into the process of qualifications or seeding for that Rugby World Cup. And speaking of which, I was kind of thinking about this and decided not to make a video of it, but we're going to talk about the final news. I mean, again, there's been a lot of news going on just announced by the World Rugby Cup Association about expanding the Rugby World Cup, starting with the next edition in 2027, which is taking place in Australia, of expanding the teams in the Rugby World Cup from the current 20 to 24. With the power of video editing, I'm going to go into explaining how that process is going to be done. And here we go. This is the new Rugby World Cup format. As you see, we're, like I mentioned before, we're moving from 20 to 24 teams this coming up Rugby World Cup. It's going to be 6 pools of 4 teams instead of your 4 pools of 5. Top 2 teams from each pool, plus the 4 best third place teams will qualify into a 16-team knockout. So the knockout round, which usually is 8 teams, is expanding to 16. So 1 extra round of knockout, but 1 less round of pool play, which actually makes it a 1 week less of a Rugby World Cup, which for a lot of people, and man, if you watch this year's Rugby World Cup, it was a brutal Rugby World Cup in pool play. I mean, a lot of teams were pretty beaten up by the time they played that 4th game. This is only 3 games in the pool play instead of 4, and that really does make a difference. The hope is with this expansion, 24 teams, first and foremost, is to allow certain teams that missed out on the competition this year to possibly get in. And then also what the hope is, we don't know how the pool determination is going to be, but you're hoping that there's going to be a little bit less lopsided play if you include a little bit more vast range of teams. Less of these 87-7, 74-0 scores. And then also, too, it makes the pool play every game a lot more important because you're only playing 3 with teams of 4. And it makes those games even more important. I mean, if you watch this year's Rugby World Cup, the pool games were pretty important too. This will actually make them more important. And then it makes that 16-team knockout round really exciting. So the thought is that this will obviously make the Rugby World Cup more exciting, but it also will include a lot more teams. I mean, again, if we bring back up the top 12 teams and then the top 24 teams, I'm also going to throw in your top 30. You know, you can give the possibility of the teams that are from 25 to 30 the possibility of possibly making it into the Rugby World Cup. So the goal is, again, to try to increase the game of rugby on all levels. Now, of course, criticism of it, you don't need that many teams. Now you're going to add more teams that are not of good quality. We'll have to see when this happens in 2027 with Australia first and foremost. But again, I'm excited because I do feel it adds a little bit more of a chance for other teams to compete. Again, your teams like Brazil, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland. It gives them, I feel, a chance to now start to get some attention. I mean, again, you just look at those teams that did make it into this Rugby World Cup that are a little bit below second tier, like Portugal, like Namibia. I mean, Chile, they really had a chance to shine. Granted, some lopsided losses, but man, Portugal, God, they were the success story of the Rugby World Cup. And they only won 1 game, but what a game they won against Fiji. I mean, it was huge. So I think it creates more of those moments. And again, I feel that definitely will give a shot in the arm to Portugal with rugby. And who knows? Maybe especially with the possible inclusion in this Nations League we were talking about earlier, being added into next year's Rugby World Cup, if they're part of the 24 teams, it really does give these countries more to keep working for and more investment into rugby. And I mean, that's great for everybody. So, yeah, a lot of big things. I know I talked about a lot. Just let me know what you think about that in the comments below. What you think about this Nations plan. Again, we still don't know all the nitty-gritty of it. We still got to see how this new format for the Rugby World Cup works out with the inclusion of 4 more teams. Again, I think that's just great for all these other nations that are developing more into rugby powerhouses. And I hope, ultimately by the time 2031 rolls around, when we host a Rugby World Cup, maybe you'll start to see some of those top tier 1 nations kind of starting to struggle with the rising top tier 2 nations, and you'll start to see a little bit more parity amongst those teams. We'll see. I mean, who knows? So again, thank you very much for watching my video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll see you on the pitch.